Adis, good to see you again. Explain to us exactly where you are right now. When I was talking to you in the last hour, you were saying that you're expecting those evacuations to begin any minute now.
Exactly. Well, we still haven't seen the buses coming on, but we are on standby. They're still saying that they should be on their way, ready to reach here any moment. But let me just tell you a little bit about where we are exactly. Some are actually referring to this point as ground zero, because this is the exact transfer point where those civilians in their buses are brought to immediately as they get out of that enclave besieged by regime forces. They first go through the regime-held western part of the city, and the first stop is right here. This is essentially what used to be a car park area for buses, and it makes sense to bring all those buses here, and from there on, those civilians would then be transferred to other areas, refugee camps in the larger Aleppo province, as well as the Idlib province. So this is pretty much as close as we can get to the regime forces. In fact, some of the opposition rebels rather are telling us that just behind those green set of trees, just behind those trees, you can see the regime forces positions. They are holding their positions there, and in fact this is also the area where one of those initial convoys came under attack earlier this week. And after the deal, the evacuation operation was suspended. Now we are told that the ceasefire is back on again, and even though you are hearing sporadic gunshots, they're telling us this is not necessarily part of the fighting, or at least they think so. But normally what used to be probably a front line between the regime forces and rebels is now used as a major crossing point for those civilians who are brought out of the enclave, and from here on, and as you can probably see also, some of the people on the ground, they're wearing blue or red jackets. They are part of different humanitarian aid groups, and they are providing logistical support for those people, as well as first aid. Some of them are also among the injured and the sick, so there are also a few ambulances just near us, so they are from this point taken on to other new locations, to their new homes rather.
Well, give us a bit more detail about the onward journey. I mean, where are the different options for these people to go?
Well, for now, it seems that most will go to either pre-existing refugee camps, and many of them are already running full capacity, but they will go over capacity. Some of them already have families, because remember, as I was saying earlier, Idlib, the province of Idlib at this point, this is one of the last remaining strongholds of the rebels after they've lost Aleppo now. Idlib is now home to many civilians who fled different parts of this conflict area of this country, and now many of them already have families there. So some will go to their families, some will go to their refugee camps, but we also know from humanitarian groups like Turkish Red Crescent just announced earlier this week that they are planning to build a new refugee camp for about 10,000 people. So that is also something. But remember, the numbers are huge. I mean, we're talking about at least 50,000 civilians still waiting to come out of eastern Aleppo. That's according to UN estimates, but Turkish officials say that could go up to 60 or even 70,000. And for those who don't have any other place, they will be hosted in temporary locations, and some, if absolutely needed, might also have the chance to cross over to Turkey. Turkey expressed its willingness to accept more refugees if necessary.
Adis, you're one of the few international journalists who's had this access, who's managed to get into Aleppo. Tell us a little bit about your journey in. You were talking about the humanitarian conditions faced by many in Syria. Is that something that you saw? What is it that you saw exactly?
Well, what I saw today, until we've got to the outskirts of the Aleppo, we're immediately next to the Aleppo city, but obviously we cannot enter eastern Aleppo, that enclave where the conditions are worst. I mean, there we are getting reports of people without any water sources, without any electricity, medical supplies. They are just living on their mere food sources, and they are still threatened by regime forces if the ceasefire collapses, they are afraid that the conflict, the clashes rather, might get out of control and they might find themselves under bombardment again, which is something they lived through already for many weeks now. But for the rest of the country, I mean, the Idlib province that we've driven through until we've come here was usually a frequent spot for airstrikes by the Russian Air Force as well as the Syrian regime. So we passed through many buildings that were collapsed visibly by airstrikes. But still, though, you could still see many people out on the streets and as well as many cars. I mean, in certain parts of the roads, there was even traffic. And when I asked our security detail how come it looked so lively outside, he told me that people were taking advantage of a rare opportunity. Because there's a ceasefire right now in effect, Idlib province is not seeing as many airstrikes in the past few days, and the fighting also seems to have slowed down in certain areas. So people are going out more often. Here and there you see some shops open, but they have very limited goods, only a few kinds of fruits and vegetables maybe. But as I said, the economic activity is still going on, life is still going on, but these people are deprived from many things, and they are also living on humanitarian assistance, mostly through agencies that are entering through the Turkish border.
That is incredible what you're describing, Adis. Just gives us a sense of how desperate people are just for some sense of normality. Now, conditional to this new deal being signed was the evacuation of Shia opposition in the towns of Kafraya and Fua. What are we hearing about that evacuation?
And I think that's a key point, Malin, and I think this is exactly why we are seeing a delay right now. This evacuation was supposed to resume many hours before, earlier rather, and they are telling us that getting both of these two evacuations to take place simultaneously, it's what's taking so much time. As you said, under this new deal, they now will allow two more villages, namely Fua and Kafraya. These are Shia-held villages, but besieged by opposition forces. So in return for letting out civilians and opposition forces out of eastern Aleppo, we will see these Shia civilians mostly being evacuated out of Fua and Kafraya. And I have updated numbers for you on that one. We were just told that because they're still working fine details of how exactly this evacuation will take place. And they told us that in proportion to those respective populations, they told us they expect 25,000 people initially to be brought out of eastern Aleppo in return for 1,250, because that is already a big number compared to the 4,000 or so who live in Fua. But as we've said, 25,000 will be roughly half of how many lives in eastern Aleppo already. But obviously they are also pointing out the logistical difficulties of evacuating so many people, because remember, convoys are generally rather smaller for security purposes. In one single transfer, we are normally seeing 30 to 40 buses maximum. And as we are told, this first round of evacuation right now will take place with 25 buses. But these transfers, as they said, as long as the ceasefire can be sustained, these transfers will continue throughout the day, even into the night. And they're hoping that the initial phase could continue until they evacuate as many as 25,000. That is going to be a hefty task.
Okay, Adis, really good to speak to you. Adis Tianshan there, west of Aleppo city.